Hi there, welcome back to your favorite deep dive show on stories contemporary and consequential for India. This week I bring three, one from domestic politics and two from foreign affairs, but with tremendous impact on home policies. First up, we take a look at the political churn in Bihar with the Election Commission's drive for a deep cleanup of the electoral roll in the state. Ahead of elections, it has raised a few hackles and some questions about the very basis of our democracy. Then I take you to an interesting geopolitical development in our neighborhood. Russia has become the first country in the world to recognize the Taliban government in Kabul. Did you miss the irony there? Russian tanks had rolled in the 1970s to throw out the Mujahideen, Taliban's precursor. The military intervention happened at a considerable cost. Russia lost 15,000 men by the time it called it quits in 1989. In a double irony, this happened in the same week as the United States de-recognized Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, as a terror organization in Syria. We will understand, connect the dots. And last, what's with Donald Trump's infatuation with tariffs? There's a history and a template which the American president seems to be subconsciously following. We'll give you a deep dive. Let's get going. It was a week of geopolitical ironies in the world of diplomacy. Russia became the first country in the world to recognize the Taliban government in Afghanistan. Parallelly, the United States re-recognized Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Syrian rebel group that overthrew the Assad regime and is now in power. Its chief, Ahmed alShara, was a designated terrorist with a bounty of $10 million on his head by the CIA. He now gets photo ops with the American president. Last year, Shara led a coup against the House of Assads in Syria, ending their 54-year-long run at the helm. This also ended a Shia regime that was aligned with Iran, and hence seen as a pariah state by the mostly Sunni neighborhood. And of course, by Israel. No wonder America blinked or looked the other way when Shara's forces laid siege of Damascus and ultimately overthrew Bashar al-Assad, who now cools his heels in a suburb of Moscow. Meanwhile, Shara has completely realigned himself with the West, courtesy some push from the Saudis, of course. Look at the trajectory. Before picking up the cudgels on behalf of Al-Qaeda-affiliated Jabhat ul-Nusra against the Shia Assad regime, Shara had cut his teeth into armed terrorism with anti-American terror activities in Iraq in the early 2000s. He became a protege of Al-Qaeda chief al-Baghdadi and earned the notoriety with the alias or nom de guerre of Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. During the second Obama administration, as the Americans decided to go after Baghdadi, a nimble-footed Shara completely distanced himself from his mentor, jettisoned the al-Nusra front, and morphed into a fighter against the Islamic State under the HTS. By 2016, Shara had cut his ties with Baghdadi and his entire network, and it was time to evolve further. For him, Syria had to be liberated from un-Islamic rule of a Shia-led Alawite Druze Christian hodgepodge to turn it into a true Islamic government. It is likely that by this time, of all the militias active in the Syrian theater, the Israelis and the Americans found him to be the most capable of taking on the Assad regime. That's when the transformation from a designated terrorist, al-Jolani, in fatigues to clean-shaven alShara in dark suits was perhaps put in motion. In his first outreach that he made to the Americans through an interview with the PBS in 2021, he made it clear that his fight was against Assad and his Russian backers, and not the West. He even slipped in that he used suicide bombers only against Russian-backed militias, never against any American or European targets. One should not miss the choice of the platform. PBS is American public broadcaster, and it gave him a good 60 minutes of interview to build his narrative. He used the same interview to morph into an Arab nationalist, partly influenced by the socialist Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. Par for the course as we are discussing geopolitical ironies here. The statement by Marco Rubio removing the terror designation of Shara this week said that he has disbanded the HTS and that he has promised to fight against terror in all its forms. Read Iran.
And as you may know, today President Trump will issue a new executive order lifting U.S. sanctions on Syria, reaffirming his belief that the Syrian people deserve a future of safety and prosperity. This policy reflects the president's conviction that American leadership can unlock new paths to regional stability.
Trump has already met and obliged a suited, booted alShara with a picture during his Middle East visit in the month of May, and announced lifting of all sanctions on Syria with the changed circumstances. As that Bob Dylan number goes, for the times they are a-changing.
How did you find the Syrian president?
Right. I think very good. Young, attractive guy, tough guy. You know, strong pass. Very strong pass fighter.
Keeping up with the changing times, let's look at the other irony, perhaps juicier one. Imagine circa 1979. Russian tanks rolled into Afghanistan, marking a tectonic shift in the politics of Central Asia. The great game had turned a leaf and the theater was hot again. That was still the peak of Cold War, and the Soviets would not have realized they were heading into a war that would shake the very foundations of the USSR. By the time the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan wound up, they had lost 15,000 men and billions of dollars in national wealth, plus the wounds to lick, having been defeated by a ragtag militia of mujahideen, though of course trained by the ISI and funded by the CIA. The Taliban evolved out of that period, most of its fighters having fought the communist jihad as a creed. The godless Russians were the sole enemy in their world. USSR stopped existing a couple of years later. One would have thought the wounds would be deep. The Taliban regime in Kabul was a scar, a daily reminder of why the USSR became Russia, among many other factors. So when 9/11 happened, the Russians turned around, came out in full support of the Americans, and provided their airspace for American and NATO flights to go into Afghanistan. In the backdrop of the Ukraine war and the battle lines between Europe and Russia, it is hard to imagine that just 25 years ago, the Russians were providing full logistical and ground support to NATO forces in their war against the Osama bin Laden and the Taliban. That was the time when Putin even floated the idea of Russia joining NATO. Another irony. But then let's pull back. In 2021, the Americans pulled out of Afghanistan as the Taliban rolled into Kabul, displacing the West-backed, democratically elected government. The ensuing chaos and the pictures from Kabul became a testament of an empire in retreat. Like the Soviets then, America had wounds to lick. Surprisingly, Russia was one of the very few countries that did not close down their embassy. They followed it up with an economic deal with the Taliban in 2022, agreeing to supply oil, gas, and wheat to Afghanistan. This paid dividends. In July last year, for example, the Islamic State in Khorasan province, or ISKP, killed 130 people at a concert hall on the outskirts of Moscow in Russia's deadliest terror attack in recent memory. The ISKP operates out of Afghan soil. Having an ambassador in Kabul helped. Putin rang up the Taliban and called them his allies. In April this year, in fact, Russia moved Taliban out of its terror list. Now connect the dots. Russia is struggling with the Ukraine war, Russia facing sanctions, America muscling its way into Syria via Ahmed alShara, the Russians responding with firming up the Taliban connect. On their mind would also be an alternative access to the Indian Ocean via the North-South Transport Corridor and the Chabahar and Bandar Abbas ports in Iran via Afghanistan. Russians would also be mindful of the fact that Trump is trying hard to reclaim the Bagram air base on the outskirts of Kabul, which means Americans could be back in Afghanistan. Another irony, China is not recognizing Afghanistan despite having their ambassador there. You know why? Because it might annoy Pakistan. And Pakistan is also not recognizing Taliban because Taliban does not recognize the Durand Line. Let's close this segment on geopolitical ironies with the best one. Also this week, Israel found itself in the company of Pakistan, with Benjamin Netanyahu formally recommending Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. Allah and Moses do come together. For times they are changing. Moving on.
If you go back and look at some of the good presidents, our country was the wealthiest, proportionately the wealthiest, from 1870 to 1913. It was an all-tariff country. We didn't have income tax. That came in in 1913. We had tariffs. And we had so much money we didn't know what to do with it. We had, we had a couple of presidents that were very, very strong. McKinley, I guess more than anybody, but he was the Tariff King, but he was very, very strong. It's sort of sad. He made a fortune for this country, became very rich, and then Teddy Roosevelt went out and vice president, and he spent the money. And they said Roosevelt was a great president. And let's say he was a great president, but the money was paid by McKinley with tariffs. Tariffs are charged by other countries at levels that are ridiculous. And I call those other countries, and every one of them is willing to give us everything now, by the way, just so you know. Sir, we'll charge you no tariffs, nothing. We'll give you everything. We'll give you access to our markets. We'll give you everything. Is that a correct statement, Scott?
This was Donald Trump talking high about the 25th American president, William McKinley, who was in office 1897 to 1901. Did you hear how Trump describes him as a tariff king? The same phrase he reserves for India these days. McKinley represented an era in American economic history when tariffs were a widely used tool or weapon for both protecting nascent American industry and promoting domestic manufacturing. This era lasted for about 70 years, from the end of the Civil War in 1860 to the Great Depression in 1930. This was a period when they were the chief source of, or tariffs were the chief source of revenue for the federal government. Again, something which makes Trump nostalgic. The tariff walls ring-fenced American economy against the mighty manufacturing muscle, not of China, but of the United Kingdom and other industrialized European powers at that time. The first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, was as vocal as Trump these days about tariffs as a tool and a hawk on discouraging imports from the United Kingdom. The post-Civil War surge in industrial growth of America had much to do with tariffs providing guardrails to American steel industry, for example, against cheaper European steel. The steel industry fed into the railroad expansion, again heavily supported by tariffs. The two, steel and railroads, formed the foundation of the first wave of American industrialization that changed both the physical and economic geography of the United States. McKinley, even before he became president, brought what is called the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890, raising tariffs to the highest levels in American history at that time, levels which are being talked about by Trump now. Like the average tariff on imports reached a peak of 50%. Just for perspective, before Trump arrived on the scene in his first term, average American tariff was 3%. There was a window in the McKinley Act to negotiate reciprocal tariffs with trading partners, but only if there was a hard bargain. So what seems like novel in the manner of Trump is a copybook McKinley from the 1890 Act. Also, through much of this period of 70 years, the US Congress was in control of the Republicans, and tariffs were a central feature of their economic policy. That DNA has continued with some atavism and is reflecting in Trump rather strongly. The tariffs kept increasing post the First World War as the US calibrated its production and supplies in response to recovery of the European nations. Then came the 1930 Tariff Act, also called Smoot-Hawley Act, by which the Hoover administration jacked up the rates even further, making the tax more broad-based. Trade partners of the United States, Canada, France, UK, and others retaliated, bringing down overall global trade volume. For example, the US imports from Europe declined from US dollar 1.3 billion in 1929 to just 390 million in 1932, while US exports to Europe fell from US dollar 2.3 billion to 784 million in the same period. Overall, world trade declined by some 66%, coming as it did at the cusp of the Great Depression. The tariff war added to the economic woes and fueled the depression even deeper. The 1930 Act was aimed at specifically protecting American agriculture in crisis, but the remedy proved worse than the disease. With corporations passing off the tariff burden to consumers, higher prices of food, clothing, and household items strained budgets of already struggling American middle-class families. It was an era of tumult. War clouds were gathering. Economic uncertainty was peaking. Tariffs were not helping. And then the World War II happened. As America came out victor and hence more confident on the other side of the war, with its allies, it set out to refashion world economy. Lessons from the 1930 Act and the Depression shifted accent on increased trade through tariff reductions. The loss of revenue on account of lower rates was more than compensated by increasing global trade volumes. Free trade agreements became the norm, with America shepherding the setting up of institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and of course, subsequently the World Trade Organization. It was transatlantic consensus at work, with Anglo-Saxon, Euro-American chemistry deciding what the rest of the world would do. This had much to do with American swagger as the new empire post-World War II. A post-war surplus economy made America carry allies from Japan to Germany, from Korea to Canada on its shoulders. And then, among the rising tide, raising all boats, rose one ship, China. A still confident Washington handheld Beijing through the 1970s and 1980s, facilitating its entry into the World Trade Organization, even as it transferred much of its own manufacturing base to Chinese cities, making China the shop floor of the world. The dragon bid its time, thieving on intellectual property, rummaging through global supply chains, strengthening its grip over end-to-end production cycle, and bared the fangs only recently. The gloves are off. The dragon is breathing fire down the American neck. The Second Empire has come undone.
While the United States and many other nations play by the rules, these countries use government-run industrial planning and state-owned enterprises to rig the system in their favor. They engage in relentless product dumping, forced technology transfer, and the theft of intellectual property. The United States lost over 3 million manufacturing jobs, nearly a quarter of all steel jobs, and 60,000 factories after China joined the WTO. And we have racked up $13 trillion in trade deficits over the last 2 decades. But those days are over.
This was Trump, all fire and brimstone, launching a fusillade against the Chinese at the 2018 UNGA in his first term. If you look at the timings of Trump's tariff war, you realize the psychology behind the moves. Like in the 18th century, so now, it's a less confident America creating moats as it negotiates its place with the rest of the world. In a Thucydides trap with China, it is American angst playing out. The United States government has gained with its coffers richer by $100 billion since January. The annual tariff haul could land at around $300 billion. But this is the money American companies and importers are paying to the government. How long before they recover this cost from the end consumer? That's when the pinch would begin. As per a study done at Yale, Trump's tariff tantrums could cost American families around $2,300 this year. The study goes on to paint a depressing picture for the American economy. that might shrink by as much as $110 billion per annum going forward, with reduction in employment and increase in inflation. The American national television has been debating for some time now how expensive their shoes and T-shirts imported from Vietnam and Bangladesh are going to get with the tariffs imposed. It will not be over till it's over. It will run its full cycle. Just in case you thought it's about Trump, no, it's about America. All the tariffs imposed during Trump's first term were retained by the Biden administration. Tariffs have morphed back to being a strategic instrument for achieving economic and political ends. Trade liberalization is history. It is back to reciprocal trade agreements instead of a global commons approach. Each nation has to guard its core interests. In the case of India, there is tremendous pressure to concede on GM crops. Because if you look at it, having outsourced most of its goods economy to China, there's very little America can offer India. It comes down to two sectors, defense and agriculture. Both, by their very nature, directly affect national security and sovereignty. The United States is itself struggling with the side effects of GM crops on the health of its citizenry, from mass obesity to increasing rates of cancer. Many new age ailments could be connected with the biotechnological tinkering with crops. But since America has nothing else to give, it would want to force those onto its allies like India. The Modi government has held on to its own till now, and hopefully would continue to do so till the Trump's tariff tantrums settle. There's no short-term solution to this crisis. Moving to the final segment. The issue of substantive revision of electoral rolls in Bihar is sub judice. The Supreme Court, hearing a clutch of petitions, all of them from the opposition parties, has upheld the Election Commission's remit of holding the special intensive revision in Bihar, thus throwing out of the window primary argument of the opposition that it should not be carried out in the first place. There have been some valid grounds which the EC should have thought through before launching the deep cleansing of electoral rolls in Bihar, last done in 2003, and the Supreme Court might crease out those drawbacks in its next hearing. But the politicking by the opposition bloc has veered towards the irresponsible as usual. Look at this post by Asaduddin Owaisi of the AIMIM. He's calling the authentication drive by the EC a backdoor entry of the NRC, the National Registry of Citizens, a bugbear created for the minorities, specifically the Muslims post the CAA NRC protests of 2020. M.A. Baby, the chief of the Communist Party of India Marxist, wrote an op-ed in which he termed the roll revision a continuation of CAA NRC debate and called the trio of CAA NRC SIR an antiquated 20th century idea which defined citizenship as an exclusionary concept. As an NRC hawk who believes India is making a big mistake by not rolling out a national register of citizens that has been mandated by the Supreme Court itself, this raising of NRC bogey by the opposition is opportune time for me to reflect on the issue briefly. First up, here's a list of some countries that mandate a national registry of citizens based on which they issue national ID cards, which the citizens, of course, need to acquire and keep as proof of their citizenship. Germany, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, all in the Western Europe. Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia to our east, South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria in Africa, UAE, Israel, Kuwait in West Asia. Over 100 countries, in fact, maintain a mandatory national registry of its citizens around the world, rich or poor, developed or developing alike. And unlike what M.A. Baby wants us to believe, most of the nations have evolved their idea of citizenship in the last 50 years, responding to the complexities of globalization. Now let's come to our neighborhood. Pakistan maintains a mandatory registry with compulsory registration by its citizens Similarly do Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, and of course China. Just leaves us in India and possibly Afghanistan. Imagine the illegal Bangladeshi infiltrators who are taking advantage of India's porous border and even more porous systems have to mandatorily be a part of the NRC in their home country. But there are some here in India who make their stay or the stay of these illegals a touchstone of India's liberalism, secularism, wokeism and whateverism. It's taking national security concerns. Since this episode has been about ironies, I shall close with one. The opposition argument in the Supreme Court hinged on citizenship count being the sole preserve of the Home Ministry and not that of the Election Commission. Then is it a natural corollary that they would allow the NRC if the Home Ministry picks up the tab? Again, they have argued that the Aadhaar card should be allowed to claim presence on the electoral rolls. The same opposition resisted tooth and nail the idea mooted by the Modi government in 2021 that the Aadhaar card be linked with the voter ID cards. As they would say, irony died an electoral death. Thanks for watching.